Hi, this is Steve Rigolosi, and today on Forgotten Mysteries, I have for you Down in the Zero by Andrew Vachss. This is copyright 1994 by Knopf. And I know what you're saying to the screen right now. You're saying, but Steve, you don't read such contemporary fiction. Where is the 1950s obscure mystery that I was expecting when I tuned into your video tonight? And to you, I say, you're right. I don't usually review books that are so contemporary due to my stated manifesto of only reviewing books by non-living writers. But I do read plenty of contemporary fiction. I just don't talk about it here. I can talk about Vachss, though, because he died in 2021. And I feel that for that reason, I can talk honestly, share my feelings about what I liked about his books, what I liked less about his books, and so on. So let's get started. So Andrew Vachss was one tough cookie. If you ever see a picture of him, he wore an eye patch that I believe was the result of having lost an eye when he was younger due to a horrible accident. And he was also a child welfare advocate and a lawyer. And in his career, he saw some of the most horrible, horrific, inhuman things you can possibly imagine. And those things find their way into his books. So I'm talking hardcore pedophilia and pornographic rings and bondage and domination and torture, both physical and psychological. And each time you pick up one of his books, or each time I pick up one of his books, it's almost with a sense of trepidation as to, oh God, what kind of horrible thing that I have never read about before am I going to read about in this book? Because it's always something. And that is something to be very aware of when you decide to pick up any book by Vachss. It goes to very dark places, the darkest. If you don't have the stomach for it, if you can't handle it, don't even try, because you'll end up crying, or you'll put the book back on the shelf, or you'll be so disturbed you won't even be able to speak. So know that up front. Vachss wrote a couple of different series, and he also wrote some standalones, but he's best known for the Burke series. And Burke is eponymous. He's only known as Burke. No parents, grew up on the street, ended up in jail, serving in the military, and now is, for lack of a better term, a mercenary or a soldier of fortune, where you call him if you have a problem, and if he thinks you're worthy of his help, he will help you. He is not a hitman. You can't say, oh, I want to get rid of my wife and collect her insurance money, and have him say, okay, I'll do that. He only acts negatively or violently against those who he considers the scum of the earth. And believe me when I tell you, the scum of the earth populates these pages. These people, the villains in these books, are the worst human beings you can ever imagine. They're so bad that they're practically satanic. They're psychopaths. They have no thought for anyone but themselves. They don't care who they have to torture or kill or maim to make a buck or to get off sexually. They're just the worst. And these are the people that Burke goes after. If you fit into that category of scum of the earth, then Burke is ready, willing, and able to take you out. So the interesting thing, one of the things that I really like about the Burke books is that Vachss created a supporting cast that works alongside Burke. And it sort of gives the books almost like a Mission Impossible type feel, where each person has his or her specialties, and Burke picks and chooses them. Like Peter Graves choosing the photos at the start of the Mission Impossible episodes, figuring out who he needs to accomplish his given mission. And they're quite a cast. I mean, there is Michelle, who is a trans woman who's been a friend of Burke's from the beginning. She was absent for the last couple of books because she was somewhere unnamed having sex reassignment surgery. And she's back now, but really doesn't play much of a role. She just makes a cameo. There is Mama, a Chinese woman who runs a Chinese restaurant, in Chinatown in New York City. And it is sort of a gathering place for the underworld, or the criminal activities that are sponsored by Mama. And it's funny, whenever people wander into that place thinking that they're going to order some delicious Chinese food, they're made to feel very unwelcome, because it's a total front, right? They don't really want patrons in there. In fact, sometimes I've gone to restaurants in New York and been the only person in there, and I thought, oh my God, is this Mama's restaurant, right? Am I surrounded by, underworld types? There is also Max the Silent. He is a Mongolian. He is a martial artist. He is deaf and mute, and so he and Burke communicate through sign language, and they're very close. They're like brothers. They have a wonderful supportive relationship. There's kind of a running gag where they're always playing gin rummy, and Max is always winning, but they always sort of kick the can down the road, and Burke is like, yeah, well, we'll add it to the tab, but they just play for fun because they're friends and they really love each other, and that is very heartwarming. Max has a wife, Immaculata, and a daughter named Flower. There is the Mole, and the Mole is this interesting little man who basically lives in an underground bunker in a junkyard in a very rough section of the Bronx. The junkyard is patrolled by killer watchdogs that will rip out your throat as soon as look at you. And the Mole is Jewish and is very tied into bringing Nazis to justice, and that's sort of his thing. He makes his life's work into bringing the Nazis to justice, and of course, Burke's main mentor, the Prof. You never know if it means the professor or the prophet. Depending on context, it's probably both. And the Prof has this interesting way of speaking in rhyme, and sort of in rhyming couplets, and that's a little corny sometimes, but fun. And it was Prof who taught Burke how to survive inside prison. That's where they met, and who has taught Burke how to live in the outside world. And so all of these characters sort of come together to take on a mission, usually to bring down some awful, horrible, satanic person. And that's what the plots of the books are. I'm trying to think of the right way to say this. So sometimes, how you read these books about a group of friends, and usually there's 4, right? That seems to be the typical number. And it's, their comings and goings, their doings, their loves, their losses, whatever. And they always kind of, not always, but often feel like just stereotypes who are going through the motions. That's not how you feel about Burke's posse. Every one of them is a well-drawn individual, and they're not types, right? You don't, it's not the wealthy white kid who just wants love, or the nerdy bookish kid who just wants to play with his computer. They're all very well drawn as people, and they all love each other so much and are so loyal to each other. It really engenders this sense of warmth. It's the strangest juxtaposition that they live in this very dark criminal world, but at the same time there's so much love among them, and friendship and support, and not always a lot of laughter, but sometimes. And you really just come to love the supporting cast as much as you admire Burke. And that's one of the reasons I find that I just keep going back. I like the cast of characters so much. So what I find in the Burke books is that they often don't really kick into gear until about page 100. The first 100 pages, there are a few episodes here and there that kind of stitch the pages together, and there's a lot of dark rumination by Burke. He's in a particularly bad way when this book starts. In the previous book, he did something, not intentionally, that he just can't get over. He just feels so badly about it. He is in the depths of despair about this, like almost to the point of suicidal ideation. And that's what the title of the book is referring to. The zero meaning the depths, the worst place you can be, where you just sort of want to nullify yourself. So a series that is based on the very dark side of humanity gets even darker here, because Burke is so just so weighed down by guilt and barely wanting to live anymore. So you've got to have a strong stomach for that, right from the outset. Here what happens is he gets a call from the teenage son of a woman he knew back in the day, who told her son, if you ever feel in danger or in a situation that you can't get out of, I want you to call Burke. And the kid does call Burke, and because Burke is loyal to his friends, he agrees to investigate what's going on. So the kid lives in an exclusive community in suburban Connecticut, and what's happening is there have been a rash of suicides among his cohort, his friends, his classmates, the towns in the region, and people are just trying to figure out what's going on, because none of these kids really they all had their issues, but suicide seemed like such an extreme response to what they were, what they were going through. And the son, the teenager Randy, who Burke rechristened Sonny because he thinks Sonny is a tougher, more dude-like name. So he wants Randy to become Sonny. Sonny feels kind of threatened. He doesn't know why. He can't figure out if people are being pushed into suicide or manipulated somehow. I mean, this book kind of takes place before social media, before the internet-ish. And I think if it were published now, I think a lot of us would assume that the idea of suicide is being put into these kids through online bullying, cyberbullying, or social media, or the dark web or something. But Burke goes up to Connecticut to investigate what's going on. And he ultimately gets to the bottom of it. And the baddies are brought to justice in a very Burke-like way. So that's the plot. What I think a lot of Burke's critics talk about is the way he draws his women, his love interests for Burke. And I guess he's a little bit like Jack Reacher, different love interests in every book. Except Burke's love interests are always really on the edge women who are driven by revenge or something dark or a very sexually abused background that affects their approach to sex in the here and now. And that's the case here. His lover is this woman named Fancy, and she is a dominatrix by profession, although she calls herself a domina, Domina. I had not heard that term before, so I got to add a new word to my vocabulary. But interestingly, with Burke, she decides she wants to be the submissive one. And these women in all these books, they just fall for Burke instantaneously. They fall hard for him. They want to have sex with him immediately and often. And Burke is all just very, laid back about it, smoking a cigarette, very CD 101.9. Like, he can't really be bothered to chase women. He's going to let them come to him. And they do. They flock to him like he's the Fonz. And, proceed to have sex with him in very creative and kinky ways that really are pretty X-rated on the page. I mean, not triple X, but they're flirting with an X rating there. And so a lot of people say these women aren't real, right? They're just a man's fantasy of what a woman should be, just this sort of sexual toy who will give herself utterly and completely to a man she barely knows. I guess I could see Burke being compared to Ernest Hemingway or Norman Mailer. And I think that that's a pretty fair criticism because it happens in every book that I've read, every Burke book. Women just throw themselves at him. And being Burke, he would never mistreat a woman. He would never make her do anything she didn't want to do. He's respectful of these women, right? So this is why you can't fully criticize Vachss because, well, I guess you can depending on where you're coming from. But he is kind to these women. But I'll give you an example of what happens here. So Fancy, his love interest or sex interest in this book, she wants to be dominated. So Burke slaps her around and calls her a bitch and makes her get on her knees and beg. And could be perceived as, the ultimate in humiliation, but Fancy likes that. She likes that shit. So he's just doing it because he knows that is what turns her on. It's not what turns him on. He does it for her. But it's still a little odd to see that happening if that's not your usual world, right? I mean, listen, I'm not getting on the case of anybody who's into kink or whatever, consenting adults and so forth. But you got to be aware when you pick up a Vachss book that there's going to be a lot of this sort of dark sex and this kind of instant relationship between him and his love interest for the book. Another thing about Vachss and the Burke series is that a character in the books is New York City in a way. Um, so many of the books take place kind of in the bowels of New York, the underground, the clubs, the tunnels, like all over New York City. And that's kind of fun, right? You get to see the really seedy side of New York City. Unfortunately, here, the setting is suburban, wealthy Connecticut. And Burke is on his own there. So you don't get that New York feeling that you get in the other books that grounds the action. And you also don't get that Mission Impossible team approach to the plot because Burke is pretty much on his own up there in Connecticut. So I missed that. I missed seeing the other characters playing a role in the plot. Burke takes excursions down to New York occasionally to do this, that, or the other thing, but really it's mostly him in Connecticut solving the problem by himself. But I do think Burke is best in New York. So that's the criticism. One thing I really liked about this book, and it really shows Burke for who he really is that he bonds so nicely with this teenage boy who is the one who called him, and in a very dude-like way, they bond over cars. Burke drives this souped-up old, I think it's a Plymouth, that just looks like a typical New York City junker, but it's ultra souped up. Can go 500 miles an hour, and Sonny falls in love with the car, and he wants to use it for one of these a racing contest that they're going to have in town. That reminded me actually a lot of the racing scene in Grease, the movie. Remember that scene by the aqueduct or the dam or whatever, where they're racing Grease Lightning and all the other cars, and there's a scene. It's a lot like that in here. I wouldn't normally compare Vachss to the movie Grease, but this was one thing they had in common. I mean, it was completely a subplot, but it just shows that Burke, he does have a big heart for children, teenagers who are feeling lost, who are feeling lonely, who need an adult in their life to help give them some direction. And I can see any teenage boy just thinking that Burke is the number one coolest thing that ever walked the earth, because he never raises his voice. All he has to do is look at you, and you know what he's thinking, and just knows the right thing to say. I mean, he really is who I think most guys want to be, this very sort of quietly alpha male who is human nonetheless. I mean, a lot of the Burke books are all about his introspection and his choice to dwell in this very, very seedy world where horrible things happen. So that's it for Burke. If you haven't read a Burke book before, I think it's probably better to start with one of the earlier ones. I believe Flood was the first title. There's also Bluebell and Strega. Those are good too, and really show what Vachss can do. I do think, though, that his best books were excuse me, talking too long. Two of his standalones. One called Shella, which shows what he can do really in a condensed format. That book is magnificent. And then Two Trains Running, which is longer than his usual book, but very intricate, very well told, and also shows off what he can do as a writer. So if you are looking for something ultra hard-boiled, ultra noir, I don't think you can do any better than Burke. But if you have a weak stomach, please run as fast as you can in the other direction to a cozy or something much gentler, because these books will make you sick to your stomach, literally, at some of the things that go on and some of the people that Burke has to deal with, who are just the epitome of evil. I mean, that sounds like an exaggeration, but that's what they are. And the saddest part is Andrew Vachss knew that those people exist because he worked with them in his jobs prior to his passing away. So this has been a very long video. Sorry for that, but I guess it just goes to show how much there is to say about Vachss. What a great book club book he would make. And on that note, I will say thank you for listening and have a good night.